I'm Crossin. I'm Executive Director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs at the Bishops' Conference for a year and a half. Happy to be with you. And I have some remarks which will be recorded as depends, and these will be available on a website here, either here at Notre Dame or at the Bishops' Conference. And this text, basically, that I'll repeat to you will be an item also on that website at some point. And that website is going to go live, I think, this summer. So that these preaching materials will be available for reference in teaching. So I'm going to talk about the section entitled Speaking with Respect and Reverence for Others. That's pages 40 and 41 in Preaching the Mystery of Faith. And this summarizes succinctly 50 years of Catholic thinking on our relationship with others. So in this presentation, I'll elaborate on this thinking just a little bit. These days, about 25% of Catholics are in interfaith marriages. Some regularly or occasionally bring their spouse, children, or other family members to the Sunday Eucharist. Other Catholics may invite a friend to come with them to Mass. My impression is that most preachers do not really take the presence of ecumenical or interreligious guests into account. A priest friend of mine once did a survey, not highly scientific but helpful, of who was in church that Sunday at his mega parish. He found out that about 12% of the people in the pews were Protestant. And so that was a higher figure than he and his committee had expected. And that's significant. Likewise, I had a recent example about a month ago. I ran into a couple, she being a Lutheran and he being a staunch Catholic, a very happily married couple. Ran into them at a reception at one evening. And I got talking to him after a while, and he said, well, we had a bad experience, and since you're in ecumenical work, I'll tell you about it. It's one of the priests in the parish that they had gone to one Sunday preached a sermon where he quoted Martin Luther and in an offensive way. And that really turned the man's wife off. And he said, we still have the best relationship, and she'll still go with me to church, on occasion. But it did sour her, that negativity had happened. And he told me what the preacher said. And I know a lot about Martin Luther, and what he said was wrong. So not only was there an offense given unknowingly, but also that it was inaccurate. In my lifetime, there have been major changes in the relationship of the churches. When I was a boy in Philadelphia, you can still tell Philadelphia from my accent, both Catholics and Protestants did not want their members to enter one another's churches. We knew each other from the neighborhood, and we played sports together, but we never met in church. Now, as we know, all this changed with the Second Vatican Council. The decree on ecumenism, the Declaration Nostra Aetate on our relationship with non-Christian religions, and the Declaration on Religious Liberty changed the situation at its root. Subsequent documents, some of which are listed in the handout that I just gave you, they elaborate on the Vatican II documents further. I recommend in particular Pope John Paul II's encyclical Et Unum Sint because of its breadth and its depth on our relationship with our fellow Christians. It's more extensive than the Declaration of Vatican II. The changes after the Council were significant and have been long-lasting. We now enter our friends' churches and places of worship from time to time. We try to treat each other with mutual respect and love. Try to build better communities together. We serve the common good by combining our resources to aid people in need, such as the homeless folks. Among Christians, we no longer compare our best to their worst. We search together for the truth. For example, the Ecumenical Directory of 1993 notes that, quote, textbooks and other aids should be carefully chosen They should expound with fidelity the teaching of other Christians in history, theology, and spirituality, so as to permit honest and objective comparisons and to stimulate further deepening in Catholic doctrine. That's in section number 8.0 of the Ecumenical Directory. We Catholics no longer embrace a theology of return. Rather, we believe that as all of us seek a deeper conversion to Christ, we're coming or will come closer together with each other. We believe we're already, of course, joined together in a profound way in baptism. Now, what are some of the implications of the changes? I think they're rather clear, fairly straightforward. One thing is, we say positive things about one another. We cite the good example that others show. So, for example, the dedications of the Muslims to saying their prayers 5 times a day can remind us to be more faithful to our daily prayers. We can cite examples of interreligious cooperation we just did in sharing a little bit that happens in our vicinity, in our neighborhoods. These things are widespread. We can note the good example of fellow Christians and their practicing of hospitality, or their service to one another, serving the needy. For example, people in Protestant churches, as well as Catholics, they host Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in their church halls or church meeting rooms and that kind of thing. We can note that with Blessed John Paul II, he said this in Unum Sint, the example of many recent martyrs from the Protestant, Anglican, and Orthodox churches. Their example of shedding blood for Christian faith transcends our differences. We also notice the Christian values of our colleagues. Father Ed Carney was the rector of our seminary for many years. In fact, he set up the independent school that we had from 1948 to 1997. And he was definitely a man of the church, and he taught church doctrine. He was a systematic theologian. So when Vatican II came along, and being a man who always just followed what the church did and followed through thoroughly, he became part of an ecumenical dialogue with some Protestant colleagues, and in particular with a professor at the Episcopal Seminary, Virginia Theological, in Alexandria, Virginia, across the river. I always remember him at lunch telling a group of us, we were seminarians at the time, he said, you know, we have a wonderful dialogue with our Protestant counterparts, and I've become very friendly, and he named the professor, whose name I can't remember these days, but he said I've become friendly with he and his wife. And he said, I could tell you that while we differ on systematic theology, he is an outstanding Christian. And Father Carney, who maybe wouldn't have been easily impressed, having been decades in the seminary evaluating people for ordination, he was very impressed that this man lived the gospel. And that's what we see a lot in our Protestant colleagues, who live the gospel in an outstanding way. When we choose to speak about other Christian churches or other faiths, we need to do our homework, and that needs to be taught. For example, we need to look at the websites of other churches to find out how they speak about themselves. We have to cite their reputable authorities, not just any old person we happen to find on the internet, but the best example of a Baptist theologian, or a member of the Disciples of Christ, or the Methodist teacher. We need to find the best people to get the best explanations, and not just settle for what happens to come up first on the Google search. We have to avoid, I think, relying also on media accounts. Media accounts are often driven by conflict, and that's not what we're about. Our relationships are very positive, generally speaking, and need to be acknowledged that way. And therefore, we need to encourage the students not to take the conflictual as normative or as a good example of what somebody else holds. We have to bring, I think, particular sensitivity also to our relationship with the Jews, with the Jewish people. This has been, as we know, a troubled relationship historically, but now we're basically in a new era. I should note, however, that for some younger Jews and some younger Christians, they're taking it for granted. Since they've grown up and we've had cordial relationships, not a complete agreement or anything, but we've had cordial relationships, people are starting to say to themselves, well, this is the way it always has been. Whereas historically, this is not the way it always has been. It's been the opposite. We've been in conflict with the Jewish folks for centuries. So we have to work at, it seems to me, our relationship with the Jews. And in teaching, preaching, that has to be emphasized. Well, we have to work at it, because Christianity has a troubled history of relationship to the Jews. What can we say about this? Well, Vatican II altered what we say about Jews and Judaism. I'm going to go through a number of points here, just to bring it back to mind. I know that we know a lot of these things, but it's always good to reiterate them. First of all priests in a Catholic setting have to read and understand the 4 major points of Nostra Aetate, Vatican II's document on our relationship to the non-Christian religions. Number 4 is the piece about the Jewish folks. It says 4 things there that we could underline. Jews are not collectively responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Jews are not collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. Secondly, God's covenant with the Jewish people remains valid. It remains valid. Thirdly, Jews are not to be spoken of as abandoned or forsaken by God, as was done in the past. Jews are not to be spoken of as abandoned or forsaken by God. Finally, Christianity has no place for anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. There's just no place for that. So, a second major point. Both the Holy See and the USCCB have issued guidelines on preaching about the Jews and Judaism. 3 documents officially address Catholic teaching on the Jews, and they're listed on the handout I gave you on the back. One of them is with URLs where you can find the document. One is called Notes on the Correct Way to Present the Jews and Judaism in Preaching, and Catechesis in the Roman Catholic Church. That came out in 1982. The second is God's Mercy Endures Forever. That comes out of USCCB, 1986. And finally, as was mentioned in this morning's lecture, the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible came out of the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 2002. So we do have some guidelines out there about how to do things. They ought to be explained to students. They ought to be aware this is what we're called to do. Thirdly, when preaching, avoid using antiquated, biased, or casual terms to describe Jewish folks, as these give offense, as words with troubled historical past, whose meanings are often connected to the denigration of the Jews. Words that might be used casually by Christians are taken in a very bad way in the Jewish community and are very offensive. In each homily, we might try to recover something of the Jewish context of the New Testament readings, so that listeners can understand how Christ fulfills, but does not destroy, Judaism in his role as the Messiah. Let me underline that. So that listeners can understand how Christ fulfills, but does not destroy, Judaism in his role as Messiah. A 5th point on preaching. Whenever preaching about Judaism, present it as a vibrant, diversely expressive religion that holds great meaning for today. And great meaning today for its 15 million or so followers, probably a little less than 15 million. 15 million was the high point of Judaism. And after the Holocaust, the numbers, of course, were way down. And they maybe are just beginning to come back to where they were before World War II and the Nazi era. We also should avoid presenting a supersessionist view of Judaism. What does that mean? That means that Christianity has now become God's favored religion, thereby leaving Judaism without any value. We avoid this. That is not what we are holding. We're not holding a supersessionist view. Number 7, promote an appreciation for what Judaism and Christianity hold in common. That is what we're trying to say, well, this is how we're the same. This is how we're related. The Old Testament is spiritual heritage as children of Abraham. This is something we hold in the Old Testament in common. And a commitment to living out the 2 great commandments of love of God and neighbor, which are both in the Old Testament and in the teaching of Jesus. You should be aware of and avoid any expressions either of anti-Semitism, which is racist belief that Jews are ethnically inferior to others, or anti-Judaism, which is the notion that Judaism is a religion without any value in comparison to Christianity. And finally, my last 2 points on this is preach about Judaism and its members, mindful of the fact that Jesus was born, lived, and died a Jew, who brought forward in himself all that God promised from Abraham's day. And this is what we were talking about a little bit this morning, that in order to understand Jesus, we have to understand his Judaism. Why did he act in certain ways with his Jewish background? And we're coming, now that we're not in conflict with the Jewish folks, but see ourselves as friends, we're coming more and more to see that influence and to acknowledge it, and thus understand Jesus better given the Jewish background. Also, there's sometimes a tendency to do the following. Homilies should avoid equating Israeli politics with Jewish religion. The two are quite distinct. The first coming from a largely secular government, and the second from a very diversified Jewish religious community. They're not identical, but yet they're sometimes taken to be that way. And that is not completely true. So we have to think some more about these things. Let me talk about a little bit now, having said some things about Judaism and Christianity, about other faiths, especially Christian faiths and Christianity. What are some of the virtues of the preacher? In our preaching, God calls us to practice the classic Christian virtues. We are to be humble like Jesus, who humbled himself for our salvation. In humility, we recognize that we have a lot to learn about Christian living from our fellow Christians. This is just following right through from Vatican II and from Pope John Paul II. Well, we have a lot to learn from these folks. And as we get to know them better, that can help to make us better. And we have a lot to learn about our common humanity from the members of other religions, who sometimes live out the human virtues a lot better than we do. In our preaching, I think we need wisdom. We need wisdom to know our own faith well, and we need wisdom in learning about the faith of others. We may need to attend some lectures, do some reading, or even take a course about another faith tradition. This might be for ourselves, of course, because we always can learn more as those who teach preaching, but it's also for the students. The students preaching need to be continuing learners. And if we're in a situation where we don't know much about the neighboring faiths, we ought to make an effort to take a course or do something to enhance our knowledge about the beliefs of others. Perhaps a parish could have occasional lectures given by neighboring ministers or rabbis or imams or about their faith. And some parishes do that. They engage in a continual educational process. And that, I think, is an important thing that should be done. But the directory puts it this way. When speaking of other churches and ecclesial communities, it is important to present their teaching correctly and honestly. Among those elements by which the church itself is built up and given life, some, even many and very valuable ones, are to be found outside the visible limits of the Catholic Church. So there's wisdom here, but it's also humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and we have a lot to learn from folks, and we ought to engage people honestly, seeking the truth with others together, and therefore coming to the fullness of truth intended by Christ. Now, I think we'll never be able to preach with sensitivity about Christian communities or other religions without some personal experience. You have to get to know people. And that means reaching out. It's interesting, I was rereading the Ecumenism Statement of Vatican II in order to give this presentation. And one of the things it says, which I hadn't really paid attention to before, was that you have to reach out to others. It's not sufficient just to be sympathetic, but actually to do something, to be in contact with others. And so it's up to the Catholic priest or deacon, or even lay ministers, to get to know the neighbor and to make some effort to get to know them. And maybe call people up or invite people over for a cup of coffee, or take some time at a gathering of clergy to get to know folks so that they would be, feel comfortable with them. And getting to know people involves paying a lot of attention. Listening first in order to get to know folks. This is just pure ecumenism or interreligious dialogue. The first thing you do is listen to the other person. Get to know a share of their story. Building a relationship. That often goes through stages, as we know. When you first meet somebody, you might share some common human experience because your family member is involved in it. You're both involved in the baseball team, or you're both coaches on the soccer team, or something, or whatever it happens to be. There's some just common human things. You get stuck in the Washington traffic, like I do sometimes. We can always sympathize about being stuck in traffic. But also then there's sharing that grows. Well, often churches have common projects they do together. And that can be a host of conversations, just getting things organized. Who are we serving? Who can we get involved in the project to handle the practical details and all of that. Only gradually, usually, but not all the time, but usually there emerges then some kind of theological points, at least clarifying the differences, but also maybe explaining to one another. I had a Lutheran bishop tell me once that he had to learn the meaning of all those catchphrases he learned in the Lutheran seminary, and then when he was in dialogue with the Catholic friends, he had to go back and figure out what they meant, because he had forgotten since the seminary. He was just using the phrases, and the people were saying, well, what does that mean? And then he was saying, let me look that up a little bit, think about that some more. So being in conversation with the colleagues forces them and us to go deeper, because we raise questions with one another, which are for a deeper faith. And then, of course, there's the sharing of the spiritual journey, which people often don't do right away, but most religious leaders have been on the spiritual journey and been seeking as best we can to respond to what God's call is to us in the present moment. And often we have some things in common and some things we can learn from one another about that. So we will never be able to preach with sensitivity about other Christian communities without the virtue of patience, to get to know people. And this is what I suggest you do with the people you teach, that it's not enough just to look things up. Yes, we need the best sources, and we need to know what people say about themselves, not what others say about them, but what they say about themselves. But also we need to meet individuals, especially if a certain community or communities are prominent in the area where we're preaching. Well, then we should get to know people personally. And yes, well, some people are standoffish, others are engaged. And so this is something that needs to happen. Because when we get to know people, we can understand their faith more deeply. Knowledge is necessary, of course, and comes from study. Wisdom, however, goes beyond knowledge and comes from personal engagement with others. I think, of course, charity is the central virtue. We express charity toward others in our preaching. People are looking to see charity carried out, lived out. I think that's what the current Pope is doing. He strikes people as being genuine, and he's trying to live out the virtue of charity. And it comes through, and people are impressed with that. And so it's Pope Francis influencing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, The preacher whose life embodies the love of neighbor is the effective preacher. I have a little time, so I'll give you the counterexample. Okay, my pastor when I was in high school was Father Doherty, a man now long deceased, as you can tell by my gray hair. And Father Doherty was not the best preacher in the world at our local parish, but he was a man of great charity, which was recognized by many of the parishioners. And you know, that stood him in good stead. He didn't always have the right words. He would come to visit you, but didn't sometimes not know what to say. But everyone knew his heart was in the right place. Our order has a high school down the street for boys. One of our priests told me once, he said, well, you knew Father Doherty, didn't you? And I said, yeah. I did, because when I was a seminarian, he was the pastor. When I was in high school, he was the pastor. He was pastor at the parish for many years. This priest said to me, you know, I taught freshmen at the high school, a couple of classes of freshmen. And he said, I did in the first week a little survey, you know, about, you know, the religious knowledge. And one of the questions was, who do you know that lives like a Christian? And all the boys from St. Jerome's put Father Doherty's name down. Now, they didn't know what each other were putting down, and they were in a mixed class with students, you know, from other Catholic parishes in the region that the high school draws on. But I thought that was a great tribute. So he preached by his life. And when he preached, people knew it was genuine from the heart. And that counts for a lot. Not that we shouldn't teach all the best techniques and research and prayer that goes into good preaching, as the preaching ministry of faith indicates. But it's living the gospel that's most important. Finally, my conclusion. The professor or instructor in preaching must try, of course, to live out these virtues I've just mentioned, him or herself. Good example's the first requirement. We should seek as much as possible to live out the virtues we recommend to the students of preaching. The life of love of God and others is essential, as it always is.